The cafeteria. Of course, a dream had propelled him from bed, the sort which, in large measure, had brought him to his drafting table, where he soon imagined the interior shells of a six-story building that one day would become a real estate inventory of expensive walk-ups, the sort that would charm the tastes of a wealthy clientele. That, or else it would become a costly experiment in low-income housing. And as he slowly and carefully drew these apartments and their various rooms, he happened to recall a pair of his high school friends, along with the dream in which they had recently appeared, and which had driven him from bed. Just before he filled and set the tea kettle to boil, the chance meeting that had occurred in the cafeteria continued to engage him and finally to haunt him. He paused in the sometimes bedeviling work of shading, and he thought, this dream first had to evolve into a vision of its shared experience. Then he returned to his work and thought, the lives of the people in the building would necessarily and indirectly show stills of the interiors, essentially smoothed concrete covered with wallpaper, a design technique he had come across from China. Were the building ever to be fully occupied, two families would live on each floor, otherwise known as immediate neighbors. If none of the families numbered more than two occupants, the least population of the entire building would be 12 and the largest number of people would be 24. And he intended that each apartment be unique. The three boys had known each other since middle school days. Those days of aspiring manhood led to group friendships and formed the basis of the rivalries which would follow much later. Various milestones, as though some collective measure of experience, were customarily passed in a manner perfunctory at times, difficult and vexed at others. All would later agree that life was hard, short, and sweet. Some called it psychological mimicry, others called it alchemy, but the self as a literary subject devoid of what most people would regard as normal experience, as most of us know, even children at times know this, that the times are not normal. For example, thinking and reflection had fallen on hard times. The academic trade had lost its patina of prestige. The expert no longer carried his cachet of authority. Trump was a petty tyrant, a bully, and a bore who liked to dominate the attention and the imagination of the media. That was and still is his most effective strategy, free publicity. Nonetheless, one had to live with this scoundrel. People say the cell phone has changed everything from art to politics to crime. We could start with the cumbersome tintype, followed a few decades later by photography on chemically coated paper. But now we have no longer a solitary moment to ourselves while immersed in an ongoing involvement with a cell phone and the people they connect us to. But in this age of quick artifice, these phones provide the path of entry, although what still applies to most people, what they do for a living, defines nearly everything about them. To some, this remains a most interesting question and oftentimes a mystery. His musings trailed off and he paused his repetitive work in creating a shaded area. Stamina and fortitude were limping along like a pair of wounded soldiers, leaving the infirmary in favor of a noisy bar crowd. Jack was not only an architect, he also drew political cartoons in his spare time, having once been an avid reader of comics in his boyhood. The men had fallen out of touch, old high school buddies who had drifted apart. In another era, they may have wound up in some boot camp in preparation for war, but they had met by sheer improbable chance in the cafeteria. Jack was aware of the other two first Rick, then Randy. After his customary sense of exclusion had subsided, He walked up to their table feeling like a supplicant, and he despised himself for it. They had all chosen different careers, different paths into the professional world you sometimes catch glimpses of on the nightly news. Randy had become an intellectual property attorney who had specialized in slot machine patents, which included the code for the computer chips which guided their operation. His undergrad experience in mechanical engineering had led him to this direction, in this direction. Rick had fallen under the sway of a Mormon girl. He improved his French while on a 2-year religious mission at a mid-sized provincial town in Quebec. When he returned home, he found that his girlfriend was not the person she pretended to be in her letters, although he failed to marry the girl who had inspired his conversion. The habit of church-going had allowed him to meet new people, with the responsibility and challenge of caring for a wife and children in store. He, too, like Randy, graduated from university with distinction. He would join his father-in-law's engineering firm and specialize in factory floor design. Of the three, Jack was the least successful. His old friend Mike was a CPA now, a man who knew hundreds of people and informed Jack about some of their old school chums from time to time at the tavern where the locals liked to go. But the cafeteria was much, much different. Without the coziness of a hole-in-the-wall bar immersed in local lore, the cafeteria was so large it seemed to stretch to the horizon in some corners. There were Naugahyde-covered chairs with frames of stainless steel. The fake stone acetate-covered tables also had stainless steel frames, which minimized labor cost in cleaning. Jack carried his coffee toward them in his right hand, hanging to the rim of its lid with his fingertips, his arms swinging through a slight arc. When he reached the table, he said, "Well, gentlemen, it finally happened. Welcome, though improbable, reunion." "Sit down for a while, Jack. It's good to see you," Randy said, a curious irony in his glance. They were all in their late 50s. Randy had aged more than the others. He had gained weight. His eyes sagged some just above a pair of wrinkled shadows. In fact, he looked ill. Rick was still quite fit, and would no doubt be so into his 90s. He gave Jack a relaxed, confident look, saying, "Sit down for a minute, old man. You look tired." Jack returned a nod and slid one of the extra chairs away from the table and sat down. He smiled a quirky grin at Rick, then turned his gaze to Randy and said, "I heard from the grapevine that both of you and Rick hit the big time in your own separate ways." "Well, we tell as few people as possible. Plain old facts don't always persuade some people," Randy said. "Jack, guess where I live now? I bet you'll never guess." "I have no idea, man. Tell me." Jack, his wan smile lingering, aborted his intention to scratch his scalp, a sign universally understood to mean ignorance. He had no wish to give the man the satisfaction of being able to gloat over his present wealth of experience, which a personal conversation can sometimes lead to, perhaps with an honest explanation of why you lived the way you did. Spangle, just outside of town, a place once used as a truck farm that had turned to shit with debt. The owner could barely remember to pay his property tax. I caught wind of the bankruptcy quick enough when the county planned to auction off the property so they could include this amount of tax revenue on the county government balance sheet again and expect annual or semi-annual payments. The county doesn't care if the owner lives there or not. He must pay his tax or forfeit his land. The number of family farms has plummeted in the last 20, 30 years and are now close to extinction. Jack returned his gaze to Rick and said, "Sometimes life can cut off the aging process." Rick gave hint to a nod of agreement and said, "I think Randy's career speaks for itself. Productive and innovative by all accounts. He's a man respected among his associates and colleagues." Jack said, "I went to a man's wake one afternoon, just happened to be passing by on my bicycle. Never spoken to the deceased in my life, although I had read a recent newspaper story about his indictment on a charge of arson. You always did like to illustrate the obvious. That's why people found you so boring, Rick said. Jack held Rick's gaze and then said, "You were the class president our senior year, a mature, outgoing, well-adjusted kid with sights high on the future." At the time, that summed me up, Rick replied. "You always start somewhere, man." In your remarks, you wrote for our 40th class reunion, you said you intended to write a book about ethics. How did that turn out? I had difficulty with the conclusion, the outcome. Well, why was that, do you suppose? Rick looked at him openly without a trace of superiority, with a look as even as it was forbidding. Like many abstractions, good and evil have been quantified. Then he added, "But I don't think they're delivered or expressed with the same force and energy and determination. Yes, a determination to win. I examined that theme at great length. You say we all start somewhere. Yes, in terms of family and upbringing, and particularly whether it was broken or whole." Broken or whole? You mean divorced or married, don't you? I suppose in practical terms, I'd like to see a fostering of various approaches among young people who could use a helping hand. Well, no one has ever experienced the purely practical approach in this country, since problems are generally viewed as someone else's until they become yours as well. But in a democracy, you expect the common interest to prevail at least some of the time. Not when money buys influence, and we've all suffered under an epidemic of cell phone use, which, by a chain of direct cause and effect, has led to the Trump presidency, as outlandish and provocative as possible, pandering to the right-wing, religiously moral section of his base, pandering to those who would rather not have had to choose between Trump and Clinton. He paused with a faint-hearted laugh. But then Trump somehow threaded the needle of generally implausible reasons why people remembered this incident. Because it involved the police, and they didn't get many visits by the police. And even if there were such a visit, the town's atmosphere of impending dread, thanks to a doomed economy, an advancing virus, an idea laden with elemental fear, pervaded each moment, and regardless of whether banal or somehow unusual and guaranteed to slowly generate more and more interest. He paused and glanced about the cafeteria. Very few people sat alone, since the cafeteria seemed, once he thought about it, far more suitable for families with young children, even though they are sometimes completely dedicated to repelling good advice. Young children are often wild with glee, or wild with wonder, or wild with some advancing horror which parents could not bear their children to experience. His renewed impetus was supplied from euphoria arising out of Bach's Sinfonia, the musical offerings, and a few hits of assisting smoke. Jack was immersed in a lake of sound, and still another thematic improvisation. Several more times the instrumental voices would devise a slightly renewed sense of an earlier commingling. While a young boy, Jack had twice been taken to the hospital. He was convinced that some of his more vexing recurrent dreams had been induced by his childhood memories of his tonsillectomy, his throat already numbed by the advance of the infection, the men and women in masks and white uniforms who stood over him, the rigid cloth cup which soon covered his mouth and nose, followed immediately by the ether. These last few recollections appear later as reimaginings of the suffocating smell, and paired in lengthy succession various renderings of the mathematical will, loosely followed within a musical score, an escape into music. Maybe that explains one of the later reactions to a different musical exposure. As he came to an immediate consciousness of his surroundings, he first acknowledged they are of his own devising, yet rendering little detail about his ultimate underlying purpose, his essential motive. But this was not permanent, thanks to say, but a period of recovery followed by what amounted to a re-education, a different approach. What about the asymmetric arrests of many blacks and Hispanics? It's so pronounced it can't be ignored. The ordinary language of segregation, beginning with the racial classifications themselves. But there is an appreciable number of people who never receive their news from either television, the radio, or even the internet. More importantly, he had begun to think of himself as successful in some limited special context, which, if true, he had no wish to consider. A certain hard-born ignorance could supply an apologist with a few remarks he might utter with respect to the pending psychological epidemic of a frontal assault on both truth and reason. The injunction to seize upon any new idea and attempt to follow these suggestive offerings, though without the vaguely anticipated outcome brimming in mind, produced much of what appeared to be rubbish at first glance. There was nothing inherently interesting about it. That's just prior to the time a more aggressive approach should be used. But what did he mean by more aggressive in any event? And does this liking for a local underdog get him anywhere? Would Jack have a story with 5 illustrations of how he might lean in the 2018 midterm election, and why? By his account, he had devised an algorithm with a half-dozen facets, sequential or otherwise, with a predictive capability, which in part was based on the assumption of conformity to contracts or subcontracts pertaining to privacy. These always seem to require a fresh signature as a graphic image captured and compared, any deviation from which within the algorithm would prove to be an impossible departure and throw an exception and replace you with a meandering walk which could result in an unscripted encounter with a citizen or two and the dialogue which follows. A sequence of events is a brute construction, an arbitrary small pair of cutoff points within a duration, the vital dimension of the sequence itself, which provided instruction for its growth and its subsequent end. Now that the portrait of Jack is finished, we can move on to a less personal contemplation which involves the shipment of goods. The simplest example would be smuggled whiskey from Canada. No secret made of a shipment's provenance, its prior journey through the alterations of time and history, and the recreation of American atrocities and dishonored treaties with the American Indian. But quite recently there's been talk of lands expected to be inundated by flooding rivers, high with spring runoff. A day of reflective hunches can serve to remind us of communication's many theories and their attempt to explain the most impenetrable English dialect. This quickly becomes a matter of successive boasts, two men both of whom consider the other an enemy, as a world without an enemy would appear to be unthinkable. Some mutual boundaries customarily observed by most Americans would be the years a man spent in prison could, in theory, be erased and the man himself exonerated. Such a man knows he wants to work for the cause on the problems issuing from a security breach. First, we posit a 90% chance of television viewers having seen the evidence, even inadvertently so, the flickering footage of one of the captives along with his handler. The hostage looks emptied of hope. He could readily think about taking his life through various approaches, such as an overdose or a hanging from the rafters in the garage, where a brand new coil of rope is draped over a nail. Randy had a difficult time with his daughter after he and the girl's mother obtained their divorce. This expensive restoration of his legal status as single even now strikes Randy as indisputably strange. Was there considerably more likelihood of crime in the neighborhood if people knew he was away from the house? Would his daughter ever be tempted to commit vandalism, or would she ever lie to the police to protect someone during an investigation? Obstruction of justice could often be woven into a prosecutor's strategy of convincing the jury of a viewpoint with sufficient distance beyond reasonable doubt. With reference to a quarrel regarding her drug-dealing fiancé, a witness for the defense was asked then to describe her father's behavior, and later the jury found the defendant not guilty, but he was acting as though he were consumed by a problem which had no solution. A guess was the most reasonable answer, but the jurors had to be more decisive, more deliberative, like the senators who debate the admissibility of a nominee to the Supreme Court. These petitions to the Senate for their duty of advice and consent seemed more like a case of public shaming each year, where one body of attorneys wanted to show the nominee in the best light, and the other body of attorneys wished to see the man's past indiscretions exposed. Fortunately, no one had charged him with rape or some lesser crime, such as harassment. His career lay in ruins by having noted and narrated the facts which composed the truth. The separate motives had to mesh at some point in a plausible, even though temporary, union. The girl had charged him with assault, and the day after he was indicted, he had a heart attack and soon after died. After all, a common way for an active man to slip quickly away. She felt remorse that her father had passed away while they had been quarreling. The cafeteria, extensive and cavernous, had many entrances and exits. The homeless sometimes loitered near them in futile disarray, their faces etched with forlorn expressions. The ruling would be handed down the following day, the defendant convicted and sentenced post mortem. He had lost favor as a father, and his legal work had begun to show signs of deterioration in both judgment and reasoning. He would be invited to retire from the State Bar Association. Wasn't there some point in keeping busy? He asked himself on occasion. Once, just the other day,